What's up guys, Tim here. In this video I'm going to walk you through the module and do a bit of a summary about some key takeaways and ideas I think you should get from it. So for the first 2/3 of the module or so, I looked at Stingray's pots as the imposition aggressor, and more specifically I looked at Big Blind versus Hijack Stingray's pot and Big Blind versus Button Stingray's pot. I split the study into two different board types. We had disconnected boards and connected boards. On the disconnected boards, we found a 70% sizing was best, and we used roughly a 65% frequency. One thing I noted though was Hijack versus Big Blind, a 30% strategy was actually pretty reasonable. And this was because a lot of the range there is just two overcards, but also our range is just tighter, meaning that overpairs make up more of that range. So we could play a pretty aggressive small sizing, and I thought even 30% range betting looked like it could be pretty good, especially exploitatively. But yeah, the baseline strategy was a 70% sizing with a 65% frequency, and that was the same from both positions. The connected boards were slightly different. We saw that a half pot mix strat was usually the best strategy on these boards, and there were two pretty distinct patterns. Button versus Big Blind, we saw that it was pretty much the higher the board, the more we could bet. And this was because more of the button range is weighted towards slightly higher suited connectors. For example, we open hands like 8-6, but we don't open hands like 4-2. So the slightly higher connected boards were better for us. And that was reflected in the frequency we bet on those flops. Hijack versus Big Blind was a bit different though. Just given we don't have very many suited connectors from the hijack, all the connected boards were pretty bad for us. Essentially, we just make less board pairs, but also are at a nut disadvantage, given that the Big Blind makes a bunch of two pairs and straights on these connected boards. So we played pretty passively from the hijack versus Big Blind, and Button versus Big Blind it just varied based on the rank of the board. After this I looked more in detail at how we played the mixed strategies, and there's a pretty constant pattern to what we wanted to do. First, we need to estimate the overall frequency. We use that based on the aggregated report. So on the disconnected boards, we play roughly 65% frequency. And on the connected boards, it varies based on the two patterns I just talked about. We then use this frequency as a baseline for every hand, but we tweak each individual hand's frequency based on a variety of factors. One I talked about a lot was domination. So this is essentially how Solver decides to bet hands, and it's based on whether it benefits from the folding hands or it doesn't. If you want to learn more about this, I would dive right into those modules. I go into plenty of examples about why various hands might like betting and why others might not. After this, we looked at some of the check lines, and I spent a bunch of time on pro betting. Essentially, we saw that low turns were good. This is because the Big Blind defends a lot with the kind of low connected portion of the deck. So on these low turns, we have just more pairs than imposition does, and we usually have a bit of a nut advantage too, given it went check-check on the flop. Higher turns were better for imposition, given a lot of their checks are two overcards, but it's never that bad for out of position, given we still have a bunch of two pairs and sets from the flop. The main pattern we saw here was that we like to bet our unpaired hands, which can't quite check call. Essentially, this is, again, the solver trying to realize its equity the most efficiently it can. So it doesn't want to waste much equity by check folding it. So we usually see our kind of weaker draws always betting, given that they can't do anything else reasonably. We also saw a bunch of pretty mergy probing, particularly on the low turns when most of the imposition range is just overcards. I then looked at some imposition play, and the main takeaway from this section was the betting structure. When we're betting as the imposition player, you want really three parts of your range, I'll call it. We have the value part. This really depends on the formation, so in the delay lines we get to go pretty mergy, given we face two checks. Whereas in the barrel lines, the value range is more constructed by sort of overpairs and hands like that. An important part of this strategy was no matter the spot as the imposition player, we tend to mix our draws. And this just gives us strong hands in both our bet line and our check line, no matter what the river is. We also saw the solver using future bluffs. This is a pretty broad term for really any high card hands, but essentially the solver likes adding some pretty weak hands to the betting range, just so the range is a bit more polar, and that forces out of position to call with lots of weaker hands, and it just makes it harder to play against than if we only use draws as our bluffs. Finally, we looked at big blind versus cutoff 3-bet pot. We saw that the 70% sizing was once again used, so pretty nice sizing on these boards. And on disconnected, it was roughly 60%. We saw one big difference here, which was on the 9 high boards. On 9 high boards, it hits our 3-bet range pretty well in this position pair, so we get to bet a bit more often than 60%. The distinction between connected and disconnected boards is less important in this formation, and that's because our overpairs are just the effect of nuts in these spots. So it doesn't matter if in position has a couple more combos of strong hands. A hand like pocket queens is always going to be good enough to just get it in. The one thing to note about the different boards, however, is be really conscious of how the board interacts with in position's pairs and suited connectors. So on a board like 7-6-5, in position makes just lots and lots of really high equity hands. So it's a particularly good board for them. But that's really the only source of variation on these textures. We then went into a bit about the out of position c-bet strategy, and it really depended on the in-position defend versus the bet. And I think one of the most key things to remember for this is that the in-position defense versus c-bet heavily depends on whether the board is rainbow or it's suited. On the suited textures, a lot more of in-position's call is built by offsuit broadways with a backdoor flush draw and flush draws. This means there's less weak overcards calling, which means our hands like ace-king are more suited to checking, because they get called by less weak hands, which makes them less efficient in the betting line. On rainbow boards, however, there's just a lot less of these good floats. So we saw in position on a board, it was 9-4-2 rainbow. They were having to call hands like king 10 with a backdoor flush draw. The main change to strategy here was that a hand like ace-king is much more reasonable if in position's calling that wide. So that was the big difference in the c-bet strategies. And we ended up generalizing pretty much every hand in the range to these 6 lines. Essentially we had invulnerable value. This is primarily aces on these boards, and we mostly tracked that. Aces essentially just gets used to support various weaker ranges, given it can take really any line and not worry too much. We then had our vulnerable value. These are hands like pocket kings through pocket jacks. These mostly bet and sometimes check raised. We then had showdown value. This hand class is quite an awkward one to play, but there were 2 main lines it was taking. We can either bet then check call and decide versus river bets, or we can check call and check call again. I talked a little bit about how we could exploit with this hand class, but you have to dive into the videos for that. The next class is dominating overcards. This is stuff like ace king and ace queen, and this section of the range really depends on the in-position defense. Dominated overs, however, play more consistently. These are hands like jack 10 with a backdoor flush draw, and these bet mostly, but can also check raise. An added benefit with the hands in this sort of region is they block a lot of the overpairs. So our main triple barrel bluffs will be trying to block hands like pocket queens, pocket jacks, and pocket tens, given they're the main cooldowns for in position. So some of these dominated overs, which is what I've been calling them, will be really good to bet flop, but also barrel off. Finally, our air that blocks folds, we just check fold. So this is primarily hands without a backdoor flush draw, and they're just kind of weak and block the folds, so they don't really have much going on in the bet line. And yeah, that's about it for low boards. Thanks for watching, I hope it was informative. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Facebook group.